Why men return you after no response. Ladies and gentlemen, relationships in their many forms are complex, intricate, and often bewildering. One of the most puzzling aspects of modern interactions, particularly in the realm of romantic relationships, is the behavior of men who return after no response. It's a phenomenon that many women have experienced: the silence, the waiting, and then sometimes out of nowhere they return. Now, why does this happen? What is it that compels someone to come back after they've been ignored or met with no response? To understand this, we need to explore some deep truths about human behavior, desire, and the way men and women engage with one another emotionally. First, let me be clear, this is not about simply making excuses for bad behavior or defending immaturity. This is about understanding what drives people, especially men, to return to a situation in which they were previously met with silence. This is about the fundamental nature of communication, vulnerability, and the quest for meaning. Men, like everyone, carry an innate vulnerability when it comes to relationships. The fear of rejection is universal, and its impact on behavior can often found them more profound than we realize. This fear doesn't just appear in moments of overt rejection, it subtly influences actions in the build-up to those moments. In the case of men returning after no response, this fear of rejection is often what keeps them in a constant state of internal tension. The moment they send a message or make an approach, they're exposing themselves to the possibility of being dismissed or ignored. That silence, the absence of a reply, it's not just a neutral response, it's an emotional signal. For many men, this silence can feel like a rejection of their worth, a judgment on their character, or even their very being. In this silence, there's often a deep sense of insecurity that can surface: the belief that they're not enough, that perhaps they've been misjudged, or worse, that they've been deemed unworthy. But men don't just retreat from rejection, they also tend to avoid the vulnerability that comes with it. Vulnerability is not just about being rejected, it's about the fear of opening up to someone, letting them see your rawness, your need for connection, and then being met with nothing in return. The emotional armor that men often wear can make it difficult for them to truly express their vulnerability, even though it's a fundamental part of any meaningful relationship. Instead of taking the risk of being emotionally exposed, they might choose silence, which is a form of self-protection. However, when the silence stretches on, this vulnerability, the very thing they were protecting, often gnaws at them. It doesn't disappear, it intensifies. The lack of response doesn't make them feel stronger, it makes them feel smaller, more unsure of themselves. The vulnerability that they tried to protect by withdrawing may come back to haunt them, making them reconsider their actions and possibly return to face it. This return is not always a conscious decision. It's a pull, a compulsion to resolve that inner turmoil, to face the fear, to overcome the emotional distance they've created. Men may not always articulate it this way, but in a profound sense, they return because the need for connection, for validation, for understanding is stronger than the fear of further rejection. The internal discomfort of unresolved vulnerability often outweighs the comfort of silence. In many ways, the act of returning is a reflection of the emotional growth that happens when the fear of rejection is confronted. It's the movement toward reconciliation, toward being vulnerable enough to risk the possibility of rejection once again, but this time with a deeper understanding of what it means to truly connect with another person. In relationships, clarity is often something we take for granted, assuming that both parties know where they stand and what their intentions are. However, for many men, especially in emotionally charged situations, clarity can be elusive. When there is no response, the absence of communication creates an ambiguous space, one that is filled with questions and uncertainty. The challenge of clarity arises when both the intention and the direction of a relationship are unclear, and this ambiguity can be profoundly unsettling. For men, this lack of clarity often manifests as confusion about what the silence means. Does it indicate disinterest, or is it just a temporary lapse? Is the lack of a response a sign to move on, or should they keep trying? These questions become more pressing when they are left unanswered, and the lack of a clear signal can create a sense of emotional paralysis. Men, like anyone else, want to know where they stand in any relationship, whether it's romantic, platonic, or professional. Without clear communication, it can feel like they are left to navigate an emotional labyrinth without a map. The issue with ambiguity is that it can make the smallest gestures feel monumental. A single message left unanswered becomes a symbol of something much bigger. Men can overanalyze the silence, attributing all kinds of meanings to it. They may wonder if they've done something wrong or if there was a particular moment that triggered the silence. This mental spiral can be exhausting as they attempt to read between the lines of every action or inaction, hoping for some sign that will make sense of the situation. Additionally, men often find it difficult to confront the discomfort of not knowing. Society teaches them to seek certainty, to be assertive and decisive. The challenge of clarity can feel like a failure on their part, failure to understand, failure to communicate, failure to resolve the situation. This pressure can prompt them to return, not necessarily because they figured everything out, but because they feel compelled to gain some form of closure or resolution. When they return after no response, it's not always because they know what they want. It's because they are still searching for that clarity, still trying to piece together the puzzle of the relationship. The return is often an attempt to create that certainty, to force some kind of understanding out of the chaos of confusion. It's a desire to remove the emotional fog and finally see things for what they truly are. If they didn't have the courage to ask for clarity in the first place, their return might be a quiet request for answers, a subtle plea for a clearer picture of where they stand. The role of ego in human interactions, especially in relationships, is an often overlooked but critical factor. Ego, in its simplest form, is the sense of self, the identity we craft and maintain throughout our lives. It's what protects us from emotional harm, allows us to feel confident, and drives us to pursue our goals. But ego is also fragile, and it plays a significant role in why men might return after no response. When a man faces silence or rejection, his ego is directly impacted. The very nature of being ignored can feel like an assault on that ego. Men, like anyone else, are sensitive to being dismissed or undervalued, even if they don't always express it outwardly. Ego thrives on validation, recognition, and affirmation, and silence can be interpreted as the absence of these things. The lack of a response, in this sense, feels like a rejection of their worth. It's as though their attempt to connect, to offer something of themselves, has been disregarded no matter how small or large the gesture might have been. What often follows this bruising experience is not just a desire to protect one's ego, but an unconscious drive to rebuild it. Men may return after no response because their sense of self-worth has been shaken. They may have been left wondering if they are good enough or whether they measure up to the expectations set by themselves or others. Their return can be a form of ego restoration, an attempt to prove to themselves, and sometimes to others, that they are worthy of attention, affection, or care. But the role of ego isn't simply about insecurity, it's also about the need for validation. Men often struggle with how to handle vulnerability, and their ego can sometimes prevent them from admitting that they need reassurance. When a man returns after being ignored, it may not be solely because of a desire to reconcile with the person they reached out to. More often than not, it's an internal drive to reaffirm their own value. They might believe that if they return and receive a response, it will confirm that they are still worthy of connection and that their existence, in some sense, matters. Moreover, ego plays into the notion of pride. Men, particularly in romantic situations, can feel a sense of pride about their ability to navigate relationships and interactions. The lack of response challenges that pride. The return, therefore, might not simply be a matter of emotional vulnerability or desire for connection. It can also be about salvaging the pride, about reclaiming their dignity in a situation that threatens to undermine it. The emotional pain of being ignored can trigger a defiant response, a return that seeks to restore the sense of power or control that was momentarily lost. At a deeper level, the ego also operates in the space between expectation and reality. A man's sense of self is often tied to how he believes others perceive him. When there's no response, that perception becomes distorted, leaving him uncertain about how he is viewed. The return, then, is not just an attempt to resolve the situation. It is, in many ways, an effort to reassert control over how he's perceived, to regain that clarity and validation that the silence took away. The return is a complex dance between vulnerability and ego. While the man might initially retreat due to bruised pride, his return is often driven by the unconscious understanding that ego needs constant affirmation. It requires validation not only from others, but from within. In this light, the return is not simply a desire for external validation. It's an internal process, a way of telling himself that he is still relevant, still capable, and still worthy of the emotional connection he seeks. The desire for resolution is one of the most powerful driving forces in human behavior, and it is particularly prominent when it comes to relationships. Men, like all people, are often motivated by the need to bring closure to unresolved emotional experiences. When faced with the ambiguity of no response, this unresolved tension creates a psychological discomfort that can't easily be ignored. The lack of resolution leaves an open emotional wound that doesn't heal by simply being ignored. Instead, it festers and creates an urge to resolve the situation, to find an answer to the lingering questions that arise from the silence. For many men, the desire for resolution is not just about clearing up misunderstandings, it's about creating a sense of emotional order. When they make a gesture or express interest and are met with no response, their minds naturally begin to search for the reason behind the silence. This search for an explanation often leads them to reflect on what they might have done wrong or whether they misread the situation entirely. In this context, the silence becomes a puzzle they feel compelled to solve. If left unresolved, this emotional tension can lead to internal turmoil affecting their self-perception and peace of mind. The discomfort of unresolved feelings often becomes more pronounced as time passes. The longer the silence endures, the more that discomfort amplifies. What might start as a small, lingering question becomes an urgent need for clarity. Men might return to seek that clarity not because they've necessarily figured everything out, but because they are driven by an instinct to close the chapter. This desire for resolution is a fundamental human need. It allows individuals to move forward with greater emotional peace and without the nagging doubt that something is left incomplete. For some men, the need for resolution also comes from the fear of regret. If they leave things unresolved, they may constantly replay the situation in their minds, wondering if they missed an opportunity, made a mistake, or failed to act in the right way. This fear of lingering regret can drive them to return in order to clarify the situation, even if they're not entirely sure what they want to hear or what the response might be. It's less about the immediate outcome and more about the psychological need to clear their conscience, to absolve themselves of the uncertainty that continues to loom. The search for resolution is also linked to the human drive for closure in all aspects of life. We often hear about the importance of closure in relationships, and this is especially true when there's no response. Men, in particular, may struggle with leaving things hanging in emotional limbo. The idea of leaving something unresolved can gnaw at their sense of emotional stability. They may feel that without a clear answer, they are unable to properly process their emotions or move forward in a healthy way. This drive for resolution is not necessarily about obtaining a definitive answer or achieving a perfect outcome. It's about finding emotional equilibrium again. When a situation is left in a state of tension or confusion, it can feel like an emotional weight that impedes mental and emotional progress. Returning after no response is, in many ways, an attempt to resolve that weight. It's an effort to bring emotional peace back into their lives, even if it means confronting difficult feelings or uncertainties. Moreover, the desire for resolution is inherently tied to the human need to understand and make sense of their experiences. In relationships, it's not just about the outcome, but about the process, the emotional journey of trying to connect with someone, of navigating complex feelings, and of confronting personal vulnerabilities. Men who return after no response are often doing so because they need to make sense of their actions and, more importantly, the other person's response. It's a desire to fully grasp the emotional dynamics at play, to piece together the narrative of their connection, and to create closure that allows them to heal and move forward. The search for meaning is a core aspect of human existence, one that deeply influences how we engage with the world and the people around us. In relationships, this search often becomes more pronounced, as the connections we form can carry significant emotional weight. When a man faces silence or no response, the experience may stir a profound sense of uncertainty, prompting him to question the meaning of the situation, the relationship, and even his own place in the world. The lack of communication can feel like a puzzle that demands a deeper understanding, a search for answers that goes beyond the superficial layers of the interaction. At the heart of this search is a desire to make sense of emotional experiences. Silence or rejection can feel like an emotional void, an absence that needs to be filled with clarity. For many men, this void can trigger a deeper reflection about what the relationship truly meant, why it was significant, and whether there is still a possibility for meaning to emerge from the interaction. This reflection is not just about analyzing what went wrong or seeking validation. It's about trying to understand the purpose behind the emotional investment, the purpose of the connection itself. This search for meaning is also an exploration of identity. When a man reaches out to someone, he is, in part, sharing a piece of himself. The silence that follows can make him question whether that part of himself was valued, understood, or even acknowledged. It is a confrontation with the deeper layers of self-worth and the desire for affirmation. In returning after no response, he may be seeking not just to reconnect with the other person, but also to understand who he is in the context of that relationship. What does it say about him as an individual? And how does it shape his sense of identity in the world? For some men, the search for meaning in relationships is inherently tied to their need for purpose. Human beings across cultures and societies crave a sense of purpose that transcends the mundane. Relationships often provide this sense of purpose, offering a platform for emotional expression, growth, and mutual support. When this sense of meaning is disrupted by silence, it can feel as if the foundation of one's emotional world is being shaken. Returning in this context becomes a quest to rediscover that sense of purpose, to find out whether the relationship still holds the potential to provide the emotional fulfillment that was initially sought. Additionally, the search for meaning can stem from a desire for deeper connection. Relationships are rarely just transactional, they are at their core attempts to understand and be understood. When a man is met with no response, it can raise the question of whether the connection was ever real or whether it was one-sided. This existential question creates an emotional void that calls out for meaning. The return, then, can be a way of seeking an answer to this question of trying to understand if the connection was genuine, if it had potential, or if it was ultimately just a fleeting moment. Men may also return after no response because they believe that meaning is still possible, even if the circumstances initially seemed uncertain. The silence doesn't necessarily signal the end of the relationship, but rather a challenge that needs to be overcome. They may return because they believe the relationship can still have meaning, that there is still something to be understood, a lesson to be learned, or a deeper emotional truth to be uncovered. It is an act of hope, a belief that meaning can still emerge even from the most confusing and emotionally charged situations. Finally, the search for meaning is not always logical or rational. It is driven by a deeper, almost instinctual need to find coherence in the midst of chaos. When there is no response, the emotional chaos becomes overwhelming, and the individual may feel compelled to return to restore a sense of order, to make sense of the uncertainty. This is an essential part of being human, the urge to find meaning, to connect the dots of experience, and to create narratives that help explain the emotions we encounter. It is a deeply existential search that drives men back to the very situation they once walked away from, because in that search for meaning, they hope to find the answers they need to understand themselves and the world around them more clearly. At the core of human nature lies an intrinsic desire for connection, a longing to share our thoughts, emotions, and experiences with others. This need for connection transcends superficial interactions. It speaks to something deeper within us, something that is often tied to our sense of identity and purpose. For many men, the pursuit of connection is a fundamental drive that shapes their behavior, particularly in relationships. When faced with no response, this drive can become even more pronounced, often leading them to return, seeking once again the emotional bond they crave. Connection, in its truest form, offers a sense of belonging and understanding. When men reach out to someone, they are not just seeking an exchange of words, they are hoping for a deeper, more meaningful interaction, one that affirms their place in the world and in the life of the other person. Silence, therefore, can feel like a void, a lack of the emotional validation and recognition they seek. Without that connection, they are left questioning not just the relationship, but themselves. Are they seen? Are they valued? The absence of response can cause this fundamental desire for connection to become even more urgent, propelling them to return in an attempt to reestablish the bond that was momentarily lost. For many men, the pursuit of connection is not just about fulfilling a desire for closeness. It is also a way of expressing their own vulnerability. Relationships, especially intimates, are spaces where individuals expose their true selves, sharing not just their successes, but also their fears, insecurities, and dreams. The act of reaching out is an act of trust, an invitation for the other person to witness and engage with their inner world. When there is no response, that vulnerable side remains unacknowledged, and the man is left with the feeling that part of him has been rejected or ignored. This feeling can intensify the drive to reconnect as the need to be seen and understood becomes more pressing. Furthermore, the pursuit of connection is often tied to emotional fulfillment. Relationships, particularly those of a romantic or close nature, offer a sense of intimacy and mutual understanding that can enrich one's life in ways that few other experiences can. Silence can feel like an emotional deprivation, a withdrawal of the very thing that makes the relationship meaningful. In such cases, the return is not just an attempt to rekindle a spark, it is a way of reestablishing the emotional nourishment that the relationship once provided. Men may return because they miss the closeness, the shared experiences, or the warmth that came with the connection, and they are hoping to revive that dynamic. The pursuit of connection can also be tied to a sense of emotional continuity. Relationships, by their nature, are built on shared experiences and an ongoing exchange of emotions. When that continuity is disrupted by silence, it creates a rupture in the emotional narrative. Men, like anyone, seek emotional consistency in their relationships and understanding that the bond they share is stable and evolving. When this stability is threatened by a lack of response, it disrupts the emotional flow and creates uncertainty. The desire to reconnect is, in many ways, a desire to restore that continuity, to return to the emotional rhythm that once felt secure and satisfying. Additionally, the pursuit of connection can reflect a deeper existential need for intimacy. Men are often socialized to appear self-reliant, even emotionally distant, but beneath that surface is a profound desire for closeness, for the kind of deep understanding that can only come from truly connecting with another person. When faced with no response, this desire doesn't simply vanish, it intensifies. The man may return because deep down he recognizes that human connection is a fundamental part of what makes life meaningful. The need for intimacy is not just a fleeting desire, it is a vital emotional force that shapes how we experience the world and our place within it. The return, then, is often more than just a tactical response to silence. It is an act of reconnecting to the shared emotional landscape. It's a recognition that the bond that once existed holds meaning that is worth revisiting, even after an uncomfortable or uncertain pause. Men return because, despite the vulnerability and uncertainty, they believe that the connection they once sought can still be revived, that the emotional ties that bound them together have not completely dissolved. It's an acknowledgement that, in a world full of fleeting moments and emotional complexities, the pursuit of connection is an enduring and essential force that is worth the effort to nurture, protect, and sometimes to fight for. The fear of losing something valuable is one of the most primal and deeply rooted emotions that people experience. This fear can become especially acute when it comes to relationships that hold significant emotional value. For men, the realization that they might lose a valuable relationship can trigger a cascade of intense feelings: fear, regret, anxiety, and even a sense of helplessness. This fear often acts as a powerful motivator, driving men to return after experiencing no response or silence, even when they initially might have pulled away or distanced themselves. When a man forms an emotional connection with someone, it often becomes intertwined with his sense of self-worth, security, and happiness. Relationships, particularly close ones, offer a sense of stability, belonging, and emotional fulfillment. The thought of losing this can feel like losing a part of himself. If there is no response or if communication breaks down, the fear of losing this bond becomes magnified. It can feel like standing on the edge of an emotional precipice, unsure whether the relationship will survive or dissolve entirely. For many men, the loss of a relationship isn't just about the end of an emotional connection, it can be tied to a deeper sense of failure. Men often face immense pressure to succeed in their relationships, to be the partner, friend, or confidant that others can rely on. The fear of losing someone important can stem from the feeling that they have not lived up to expectations, either their own or those of the other person. This fear can be particularly intense when the relationship is one that holds long-term potential, one in which they have invested emotionally and perhaps even begun to imagine a future. The silence or no response becomes a symbol of that potential slipping away, leaving them with a haunting sense of loss. The fear of losing a valuable relationship can also be connected to a fear of loneliness or isolation. People are social beings, and relationships are a primary source of emotional connection. The thought of losing someone who plays a central role in one's life can evoke a deep sense of existential loneliness. Men, like everyone, have a deep-seated need for companionship, and the absence of that connection can feel like an overwhelming void. The return, then, is often driven by the need to preserve the connection, to avoid the emotional and social isolation that the loss of a meaningful relationship might bring. Moreover, when a man feels that a relationship is valuable, the thought of losing it can stir up feelings of urgency. This urgency can manifest as a heightened emotional response, often prompting him to re-engage or return to the situation in an attempt to salvage what has been threatened. The return isn't necessarily about knowing how things will turn out, but about taking the chance to prevent a permanent break, to at least try to repair the bond before it slips beyond reach. Even in moments of uncertainty, the fear of permanent loss often compels a person to act, to seek a final resolution or at least a chance to reconnect. In some cases, the fear of loss is amplified by the recognition that valuable relationships are rare and irreplaceable. When men encounter relationships that are deeply meaningful, whether romantic, familial, or platonic, they begin to understand just how unique and precious these connections are. The silence that follows an attempt to connect can serve as a painful reminder that such relationships are fragile, and once lost, they cannot be easily replaced. This realization makes the fear of losing the relationship even more intense, motivating the individual to take action to preserve it, even when it feels uncertain or challenging. The fear of losing a valuable relationship can also stir feelings of regret. Men might replay moments in the relationship, wondering if they could have done something differently, said something differently, or acted in a way that would have prevented the silence from happening. These feelings of regret often fuel the desire to return, not necessarily to undo the past, but to take another chance, to prevent the emotional fallout from continuing, and to regain some sense of control over the outcome. It becomes less about the immediate response and more about preserving something that, in hindsight, feels essential to their emotional well-being. Ultimately, the fear of losing a valuable relationship is a reflection of the importance we place on human connection. Relationships aren't just a source of pleasure, they are a fundamental part of who we are. When men feel that a relationship is at risk, this fear often propels them to return because the stakes feel too high. The loss of that connection would not only mean the end of a relationship, but also the loss of something deeply meaningful to their emotional and social landscape. The return is an effort to preserve something irreplaceable, to bridge the emotional gap that silence has created, and to give the relationship the best chance of surviving despite the fears and uncertainties that surround it. The human need for reaffirmation is a powerful and universal drive deeply ingrained in our psychology. It is the need to feel seen, heard, and validated in our emotional and social interactions. This need is especially acute in relationships where emotional bonds are formed, and the lack of reassurance can create a profound sense of insecurity and doubt. For many men, the act of returning after no response is often motivated by the underlying need for reaffirmation, a desire to confirm that their feelings, actions, and intentions are recognized and valued. At its core, reaffirmation serves as a form of emotional confirmation. In relationships, people seek to know that they matter to the other person, that their presence is acknowledged, and that their emotions are not only understood but reciprocated. For men, the absence of this kind of reassurance can stir feelings of uncertainty. Without validation, they may start to question their worth or their place in the relationship. Silence or lack of response can feel like emotional invisibility, leaving them to wonder if their efforts were meaningful or if they have been forgotten or disregarded. This need for reaffirmation is tied to the sense of self-worth. When we connect with others, we often seek affirmation of our value, whether it's through words, actions, or simply being present in someone's life. When that affirmation is absent, it can feel like a rejection of our identity, as though who we are and what we bring to the table is not important. The fear of being overlooked or dismissed becomes especially prominent when a relationship holds deep emotional significance. Men, like everyone, need to feel that their contributions, emotional, intellectual, or otherwise, are recognized and appreciated. In returning after no response, they are often seeking that reaffirmation, trying to restore a sense of emotional equilibrium by confirming their place within the relationship. In many ways, the need for reaffirmation can be seen as a form of emotional anchoring. Life can feel chaotic, especially in emotionally intense situations, and relationships provide a sense of stability and grounding. When a man reaches out, he is not only seeking connection, but also trying to anchor himself in the certainty that the relationship is solid, that the bond they share is real, and that it can weather uncertainty. Silence undermines this sense of grounding, creating emotional instability. The return then becomes an effort to find that anchor to reestablish the emotional security that the lack of response threatens to erode. For some men, reaffirmation is also about the emotional reassurance that their feelings are reciprocated. When they express interest or affection, they do so with the hope that the other person feels the same. The absence of a response leaves this question hanging in the air, creating doubt about whether their emotions are shared. Returning in this case is a way of seeking emotional reassurance, not just to know if the other person feels the same way, but to affirm that the relationship has mutual depth and significance. It's a search for emotional symmetry where both parties are on the same page, understanding each other's feelings and intentions. The need for reaffirmation also speaks to a deep desire for emotional intimacy. Intimacy is built on shared understanding, trust, and vulnerability. When there is silence, it creates a rift in that intimacy, disrupting the flow of communication and connection. The return, then, is not simply an effort to receive validation, it's a desire to restore that emotional closeness, to reestablish the sense of shared space where both people can be open, vulnerable, and genuine. Without this emotional reaffirmation, the relationship feels distant and uncertain, leaving the man to wonder whether the intimacy that once existed was ever real or if it has been lost. Moreover, reaffirmation is not just about the other person's acknowledgement of our actions, but also about our own internal sense of validation. When a man faces silence or rejection, it can trigger a sense of self-doubt, wondering whether he has done something wrong or if his efforts were misguided. Returning after no response is, in part, an effort to ease this self-doubt, to get the reassurance that his actions were not in vain, and to restore his confidence in the relationship. It's a way of reconciling his own need for self-affirmation with the external validation he seeks from the other person. At its deepest level, the need for reaffirmation reflects our fundamental need for connection and recognition as human beings. The absence of this validation can create emotional turmoil, leaving individuals questioning their value, their place in relationships, and their ability to connect with others. The return, then, is a way of seeking resolution to this emotional uncertainty, an attempt to restore a sense of belonging and emotional security. It's about reestablishing the recognition that, at our core, we all need to feel acknowledged, understood, and valued by those we care about. This reaffirmation is not just a form of emotional reassurance, it is the very foundation of meaningful, lasting relationships. In the end, the dynamics of relationships are complex, shaped by a deep need for clarity, connection, and emotional security. When silence lingers, it brings forth vulnerabilities and uncertainties that can drive a person, particularly a man, back to a place of emotional questioning, self-reflection, and hope. The fear of rejection, the pursuit of resolution, and the need for reaffirmation all intertwine, pushing us to seek understanding and reconnection. But it is also in these moments that we learn the value of self-worth, the importance of emotional resilience, and the undeniable truth that relationships are not just about what we receive, but about what we give to. The return after no response is not simply a pursuit of answers, it is a testament to the human need to be understood, to connect, and to reaffirm that our efforts in relationships are not in vain. While silence can often feel like a wall, the act of returning can be seen as an expression of our willingness to navigate the uncertainty, the discomfort, and the complexity of our emotions. It reminds us that relationships, no matter how challenging, are worth pursuing, worth understanding, and worth cherishing. And in doing so, we come to realize that the journey of connection is as important as the destination itself.